Good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to today's masterclass, our pandemic insight. Excuse me, our pandemic insight. Questa è bella della diretta. Excuse me a second. Okay, our pandemic insight today is going to be on cities and communities and how they will fare in the post-COVID era. Now, last week, The Economist came up with a very interesting title of an article, which was "The Destiny of Density." So it was an entire column dedicated to how cities will fare in the after-COVID era, and the argument of the columnist was that whenever cities, and especially big ones, have been hit by any crisis, they've been able to rebound. Now the question is, I think it's still on: will cities be able to rebound after the COVID? And will communities somehow be the tool, the instrument to make sure that cities will in fact rebound? In Italy, in particular, there's a debate going on between the future of large cities and the future of small cities. Stefano Boeri, who is an archistar, his idea is that small cities will come back after the COVID, but also counter arguments who actually say that, well, in fact, communities tend to gather in and around large cities. So the question is open, and today we do have two distinguished speakers who's going to be addressing these issues of communities and cities. There's Professor Sheila Foster from Georgetown University. She holds the Scott Ginsburg Professorship in Urban Law and Policy. Thanks, Sheila, for connecting from Washington, D.C. today. And the honor guest coming from the real world, as we say, is Francesca Bria, who is the president of the Italian Fund for Innovation. And Francesca, she's also an honorary professor at UCL. Used to be the city technical officer in Barcelona. So, and for today, I'm going to be asking Christian Iaione, who is a professor of urban law and public and policy at our university in Luiss, to chair these very interesting masterclass. So thank you very much for attending this masterclass. I'll leave the floor to Christian, who will quickly introduce again the topic. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in about 15 minutes.
Thank you, Andrea. It's an honor to host with you this conversation, and to have Sheila Foster and Francesca Bria animating a very current conversation that is taking place in many economic, social, and legal systems nowadays. And what we are seeing is that many ecosystems of innovation are responding to the COVID-19 challenges through the cooperation with local communities. As much as we are seeing the ecosystems of innovation also coming up with solutions. You just mentioned that Francesca Bria was the CTO, the Chief Technological Officer of the city of Barcelona, and in Barcelona they started producing masks for the COVID-19 crisis in Fab Labs. So this tells us probably something about this new era we are entering in: innovation, civic cooperation. We have the best possible in the room at the global level, I would say, and it's not an overstatement. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Sheila Foster. You just mentioned that she's Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Urban Law and Policy, but she's also co-director of LabGov, an international research platform that has one leg at Luiss and one leg at Georgetown University. And she's also the chair of the advisory group of the advisory board of the Global Parliament of Mayors, as well as a member of the New York City Mayor's Panel on Climate Change. So Sheila, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to talk a few minutes about how to think about cities in the post-pandemic era, which we're pretty far away from right now, but it's worth trying to think about them first. And so I'm speaking from the perspective of the United States, of course, but I think that a lot of what I'll say is relevant, although it has to be adapted to different regional contexts. But here in the United States, you've seen that we're one of the hotspots of COVID, but also you've seen people in the streets in a rebellion. And the first thing I'll say is that in thinking about cities post-pandemic, we have to think about two pandemics, right? 19 and rape, and they are spend a few minutes talking about exactly how they're intertwined and how they've manifested. And I'm going to focus here on New York City. I teach in Washington, but I live in New York, and I have for many years. And the way in which the pandemic played out and the way in which COVID-19 played out really manifests or highlights, I think, why these two pandemics are intertwined. So this is a picture of New York City and its boroughs, obviously, Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island. And what I'm going to show you is what I'll call the racial geography of COVID-19 inequality. And what you see here is that the oranger, the more color, the more orange you get, the more those communities suffered from COVID-19. Both in terms of infection levels, but also mortality rates, the number of people that died. And what you also notice is that those areas are the furthest from the center, right, from Manhattan. They're in the outer boroughs, and they're largely in communities of color. So areas that had higher rates of COVID, cases and deaths have higher Black and Latino or Hispanic population and lower Asian and white shares. That's controlling for poverty. This is not an issue of poverty, of poor neighborhoods, but of, unfortunately, race. The poverty rate is similar in neighborhoods with high and low infection rates. They're also an overlay of educational level, right? The share of adults with college degrees goes down as the prevalence of virus cases goes up. And higher rates of confirmed COVID cases are seen in areas where less of the population is able to work from home. They cannot work remotely. Furthermore, even though the subways virtually came to a standstill in terms of ridership, it dropped dramatically, areas with higher rates of COVID saw a smaller decline, which means more people were getting on the subways. And I'll turn to that in a minute. And finally, you know, at first, a lot of people were saying that this is a urban density problem. And now we know that the infection rates and the spread of COVID-19 is not about urban density so much as it's about crowding, and mostly indoor crowding. And so interestingly, COVID-19 is more prevalent in areas of New York City where more people reside in multi-generational or crowded households. So overall population density is not associated with higher rates, but rather indoor crowded density is. This data comes from the Furman Center at NYU that studied these rates. As a corollary, I mentioned that most of the areas that were hard hit are furthest from the center. But if you see in the center, in Manhattan, the people that were able to leave, that had the money and did not have to stay, could work remotely, left New York City. They went to their summer homes in states like Vermont, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, et cetera. And so the wealthiest people live in the center, and they were also able to escape the worst of the epidemic. So what's happening is what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has called the racial justice paradox. She said that in the COVID-19, the way that the COVID-19 manifested in most cities. In New York City, this played out in cities like Detroit, New Orleans, Los Angeles, a host of cities that these communities were hit harder. She said it's because some racial groups have more food, employment, and housing insecurity on the one hand, and ironically or paradoxically, more exposure and vulnerability to COVID infection, particularly in cities. So why is this so? And this is how the racism as a pandemic and also COVID-19 are intertwined. So we've seen that some groups have been less able to protect themselves. Their lack of ability to work from home. Only 1 in 5 Black Americans and 1 in 6 Latin Americans are able to work from home. There are frontline workers, which means that they're the ones that delivered food, that worked in the hospitals. And so therefore they had to take public transit because of the fact that they live far from the center because housing is so expensive in the center. So all of the economic opportunities are centered in cities, in the core, but yet these populations cannot afford to live in the core. They live in multi-generational households that are more common in immigrant and Black and Latin households, and in jails, prisons, and detention centers, which in the United States are overrepresented by African Americans. We saw COVID spread wildly there. Again, another crowded environment. The other thing that is worth pointing out is that many people pointed to the fact that some of these populations had what are called comorbidities, asthma, obesity, high blood pressure. But to be clear, these are linked to structural inequalities. The higher mortality rates are associated, or higher COVID mortality rates are associated with high levels of pollution. And a Harvard public health study came out in the middle of the pandemic that showed that those areas that have higher levels of what are called PM 2.5, the worst kind of pollution, air pollution, had higher rates of COVID. And we know from past studies that race and exposure to air pollution is strongly correlated. This is an area that I've been working on for many years, environmental justice and climate justice. So in New York City, those areas in Brooklyn and Bronx that had higher rates of pollution and therefore respiratory illnesses and asthma were not surprisingly hit the hardest by COVID-19. Similarly, obesity and high blood pressure, these are the same communities that lack healthy food options, that are what are called food deserts, and lack parks and green spaces in these communities. And again, so these comorbidities are very much linked to structural inequalities. So when we think about communities and the places where people live, there's something called the social determinants of health. To create healthy, inclusive, equitable, and sustainable communities, we have to take into account the entirety of the environment, what I call the places where people work, play, pray, and eat, right? They have to have green space, lack of pollution, quality and affordable housing, and places where their children can play. In all of these communities that were hit hard, they're living in environments where the social determinants of health unfortunately shaped their fate in this pandemic. Let me talk about one last thing before I wrap up and talking about how we can think about our cities after this. The George Floyd incident and policing is part of the picture, of course, the pandemic of racism. And we saw this ironically show up in the post the height of the COVID crisis in New York City, when the mayor decided that there were going to be new rules, social distancing and mask rules. But when the police went out to enforce those rules, the first 40 of the people arrested, they went right to communities of color, were Black or African Americans. So again, all of this is, you can't think about these natural phenomena, whether it's COVID or hurricanes. You know, in the beginning, they said the virus does not discriminate, but when it lands on an unequal landscape, and when we put in place rules that are otherwise neutral, or phenomena that are neutral, if we have an unequal landscape, and if we have structural inequality, structural racism, this is the predictable outcome. So what I'll end up with is that one of the interventions, I think, to thinking about how we build communities in the post-COVID era and how we think about cities, and something that Christian Iaione and I have been working on, is the idea of creating more urban commons as a response. And here are the different types of urban commons that we can be thinking of, right? A commons is a common pool resource, something that communities share. Based on Elinor Ostrom's work, the Nobel Prize winning economist Elinor Ostrom, who found that communities around the world are able to co-govern and co-manage common resources. A lot of the construction of urban commons that we've observed can be a forceful intervention both in the pandemic of racism and in a post-COVID world, including neighborhood parks to give communities access to space where they can be outside of crowded indoor environments. Access to healthy food, urban gardens and urban farms is a kind of constructed community-based commons, shared resource in food deserts. Strong collaborative economies like cooperatively run business incubators. Some of the experiments that we're trying in places where we're applying our co-city framework on the commons in places like Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Community control of housing, so co-governed housing, including community land trusts and limited equity cooperatives. I'm happy to answer any questions about these forms. And finally, constructed infrastructure commons like microgrids in communities that pay high levels of energy cost and also suffer from heat island effect in cities. And these are the same communities that were hard hit in COVID. They've been asking for separate utility systems that they can co-govern and that are affordable and meet their needs, including community wireless and broadband networks. In these same communities, there's a severe digital divide. So when we think about planning post-pandemic, I think the urban commons can be a powerful response. I'll stop there because I know that Francesca has a lot to say about some of these elements.
Thank you, Sheila. I just want to really underline the importance of your remarks that show how there is a social, racial, and economic root, and probably also impact at the basis of these two pandemics that you just mentioned. And we already introduced Francesca in a way. One thing that we did not say is that Francesca is not only the president of the National Italian Fund for Innovation, she's also honorary professor on innovation and technology at UCL within the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose in London. So, Francesca, the floor is yours. And I just want to say that if someone wants to pose, if the audience someone in the audience want to pose questions, they can use the WhatsApp number that should be appearing on the broadcasting of this webinar, and also in the comments on the social media. Thank you. Sorry, Francesca, the floor is now yours.
Sure. So thanks to both, and thank you, Sheila, for this very interesting presentation. So I think I will just, first of all, maybe give some thoughts or some responses to what Sheila just said. Actually, you initially said we may have some disagreements or some proper debate in our conversation, but for me it's very hard to disagree with what Sheila has just presented. So I'm afraid maybe for the disagreements we will have to wait from some questions from our audience. But anyway, some reflection when Sheila was presenting how important the racial justice movement has been now to create an awareness about structural inequalities and how to move forward, and how the COVID-19 pandemic and this huge shock that we are experiencing has just made it more clear. And I was reflecting on how important actually it is to have a public and just healthcare system that actually we are strengthening and reinforcing, I mean, in Italy now, but also in Europe during this pandemic. I think that it has become very, very manifest to all citizens that we need to do proper long-term structural investment into things like healthcare, like education, like housing, and the quality of life, thinking about the future, and that this is the core of our economies and the only possible way to build a future that doesn't create more inequalities or more structural inequalities. I think that also it made me think about how important it is to think in terms of innovating governance structures. So here in Italy, we did that. Maybe you can mute yourself here. Okay, here in Italy, for instance, we have been struggling a bit between how we can harmonize the level of governance from the community to the city level, to the regional governance, to the national level, and then to the pan-European coordination. And I think we are learning a lot about how it is important to kind of give power back to the community and to the citizens, but at the same time think in layers, because for instance, when you are thinking about healthcare systems, you really need a national governance to be more egalitarian and to be to cover all the population. And then in Europe, we need a kind of pan-European investment mechanism and pan-European coordination to tackle the crisis. So I think this question of where power resides in decision-making is one of the key issues. So I think I'm going to focus on 3 more points, maybe then to have a conversation afterwards. So the first one is that I think that cities are the only place where we can find a way to plan the future in a way that doesn't, go back to the past that has created a lot of the reasons for this crisis, but think about a more kind of just, sustainable, and green, livable future. So we want to be able to plan for a carbon neutral society, for a society that uses technology for the people and that tackle this kind of structural problems that were also mentioned by Sheila. And for instance, in particular, I think when we look at how we can combine democratic participation with the Green Deal or with the ecological and green transition, I think that cities are really at the forefront. And I think we can consider cities at the moment as a little bit of as laboratories for democratic innovation, but also for sustainability. And for instance, I will make some example from Barcelona, where I've been, as you mentioned, the CTO until last November. At the moment, the mayor of Barcelona and the entire city has used this emergency, this crisis, to continue to operate, to spread, to make it bigger even, the plan for Barcelona to become a real green city, where the old center of Barcelona, the famous Barcelona superblock, where we managed to reclaim 60% of public space back for citizens, which now today is more green areas, a more livable city, a space where we have pedestrians and tripled the number of bicycle lanes and so on. This project now, we managed to close 7 districts when I was the CTO. And now the mayor of Barcelona has expanded radically this program. So they told me, my God, now Barcelona during the crisis has become completely green. You have a lot of bicycle lanes, lots of spaces for pedestrians. And I think they're really prototyping this new mobility, this new connected electric, clean mobility, that I think it will be really central in our climate neutral or CO2 emission neutral future. And I think that this will enable us to understand, what kind of investment we need also in more hydrogen, clean energy, think about a different type of mobility, as I said before. And we can only do this starting from the community level and from the city level, and also then engaging citizens in the participation process that will lead to such big changes and such big decisions for the future. I mean, we have to really realize that if we want to make this moment transformative for the better, we need to take radical and disruptive decisions. And I think society will need to participate as much as possible to these decisions. And so that's where participatory democracy examples that are flourishing in cities have to become the norm. So you probably know that when I was in Barcelona, we started to grow what we call a hybrid model of digital participation and like large-scale citizen participation in neighborhoods. And we created the Barcelona Decidim, which is an open source platform that enables citizens to participate in the decision-making process. Also, we do that in fair terms, I mean, protecting citizen data and using open source tools. And at the same time, we connect this with real citizen assembly and participation of citizens in the streets. I mean, this is really a claim, I mean, an attempt to transform policy making in cities and radically redefine the relationship between governments and citizens, which I think also when Sheila was talking about the racial justice movement, I was thinking of how we can devolve more power, obviously, to these movements and to these Black communities and to these communities that are suffering from these structural inequalities, and maybe starting from changing the way we participate in also how resources, I mean, you called it the urban commons, but how resources generally are allocated in cities can be a good way. So I think the green transition then and citizen participations are two main points where cities will make the difference. And then the final point and the last point for me, of course, is experimenting new form of democracy when it comes to technology and data. And you, Christian, mentioned that during the pandemic, we also had, I mean, we had I think a huge debate about the future of the digital society. Maybe usually it was like a kind of binary debate. We have either the model where we have a big state, so more state, more surveillance, states kind of using all kinds of tools to monitor, to track, to surveil citizens, and then gather more central power. I mean, this is maybe the Chinese way. We saw it better implemented. Or on the other side, we had the binary, presented as a binary choice, which of course I want to break, of the big tech. So the other paradigm is, well, no, we don't want a big state, but we should trust more the big tech and, the kind of GAFA economy. And if we go to see what are the only companies that had a positive shock, not like a negative shock, which is unprecedented in the history of humanity in peace, as we are all experiencing, and the majority of the economy and small SMEs and communities are experiencing, the big tech, so Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, they are increasing, their price of their stocks and their shares and their valuation in the market incredibly. So they're actually winning from this crisis, which means that they are increasing our dependency from a very critical infrastructure, which is, of course, connectivity and data, that at the moment should be reclaimed back for society. So I will advocate that we have a third way that we should experiment, which is data democracy and digital infrastructure for the public good, for the public interest, democratically governed by society and citizens. And I think that this model has to be experimented concretely from the bottom up, and it is at the moment experimented concretely from the bottom up in cities. So you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that, we had a network of Fab Lab, which was prototyping, tools for hospitals and respirators, and that they were very active in providing what we needed during the crisis. I can also mention that because of researchers globally sharing data and science to tackle this crisis, we may soon have a vaccine for against the COVID-19, which should be absolutely released as a public good, as a common good in the society, and should be put free for everybody. In developing countries, in the Western world, for all kinds of communities, it should be released as a public good. And this can only be possible because of the cooperation, the global cooperation of scientists all around the world, working in open data and sharing the research to tackle this crisis. And I think also, well, we are producing a very strong amount of data. All governments have released the contact tracing applications at the moment. And I think Europe has been also at the forefront to put forward a model that preserves privacy, security over data, and decentralization, so that we can make sure that this contact tracing application can really foster the national healthcare system, but also keep democratic control, so we can keep our privacy and our fundamental rights. So just to end, I think we have a choice here that we have to make, and I really think that cities can be the place where these democratic experimentalism, that these alternatives are practiced. And this choice, I think, is what kind of society we want for the future. Can we use this emergency to create and shape a more egalitarian, green, and technologically democratic future? And can we do it now, starting bottom up, from cities and from the empowered communities?
Thank you, Francesca. I think that your, I would say, 4 key insights: cities as labs of experimentation, then the investment and the attention that we need to give to the green transition, as well as the importance of citizen engagement, and finally, which we're just saying about data democracy, as you call it, kind of together with the insights that Sheila was giving us in terms of the roots of the divides, the conflicts, and that are somehow affecting social cohesion inside cities, and they are aggravated by the COVID-19 crisis somehow. And also the ending remarks that Sheila made about a possible way forward, because when Francesca mentioned data democracy and all the citizen engagement, so the solution of the urban commons and the examples that Sheila was making about digital networks run by communities, as well as grids, electric grids that are managed by communities, make kind of a case probably for a different approach in the governance of cities. And so I go and again stimulate questions. We have already a few questions that were raised, so we prepared I think very well the ground for this second part of our conversation, which will be more interactive. So we have a few questions that are related to the housing aspect. Evidently, probably the place, the shelter where we all used as a refugee from the COVID-19. It's a key point for the audience and for everybody probably. So there is a question from Francesco. There's a question from Sophia, sorry, on housing. She's asking, could you please explain in more detail the community control of housing? Does this include rent regulation or access to affordable housing? And then there is another one from Simone that is related to housing. If you think that after living through the pandemic, people will seek out larger, more livable houses. I think that this is a question that both of you can tackle, because they have somehow different dimensions that you can both interpret. Maybe you can start with Francesca this time, and then go to Sheila.
Sorry, which one of the questions? Affordable housing.
So probably the one on the after living through the pandemic, people will seek out larger, more livable houses. We've been talking a lot about smart working, but is it smart working to combine private life in a very small place with the work life? Probably on
Right.
this
Well,
say a
I
lot.
mean, I think first of all, and I'm curious what Sheila will have to say, because she made very clear how there are certain communities that are really had a most disadvantage and really suffered from this crisis. And obviously, if you don't have a home and if you're homeless, you really, I mean, you have nowhere to fall back. I think definitely some of the measures that have been pushed here, economic measures, concerned blocking mortgages. So making sure that people that had mortgages didn't have to pay mortgages during the time of the pandemic, and then have reliefs so that people will be able to pay their rent later on. Also kind of energy poverty measures, because not everybody is able to pay the electricity bills and all the bills, and so it was requested a moratorium over this kind of energy cost, which actually very, very very heavy for a lot of families. And probably here we can mention that, connected to the question of affordable housing and housing as a right for everybody, the question of energy poverty, and also maybe mention that the Italian government, one of the most important structural measures proposed now during the last decree from the government is a huge bonus for renewable energy, so that people can change their electricity systems and retrofit their homes to make them more tailored to consume less and to consume less energy, and also to shift to renewable energy. That is something we have to do at a large scale. So I think all these, and obviously, the mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, she immediately called for a moratorium against evictions during the crisis, because this is very important to say. And this is not obvious at all. So I think that, this kind of access to affordable homes and housing as a basic right and as a human right is one of the most important issues to tackle. Then the question around, smart working and working in distance and new spaces for working, I think that, yes, we saw a boom of this kind of new solutions for working environments. We, as a National Innovation Fund, we're actually investing in a lot of spaces that provide co-working more as a community working spaces, because for the future, obviously, we do not want to create new divides, because this is what this digital world entering at this rapid speed, it can create new substantial and structural divides. And so there are two big rights. One is a connectivity as a human right. So we want to have a broadband as a public infrastructure available for all. And actually I have to say that we're speeding up a lot at this level in Italy, where is a real need. And then create mixed spaces where we can have also as workers new rights when we are doing smart working, because we need the rights to disconnect, and we need a space for socialization. We cannot, we cannot work in isolation. We need to create social spaces. And, the important thing about co-working spaces is that people create new networking. They create new way to organize and to come together. So it is very important to bring it back also to the physical capacity of people, to learn and share knowledge, which has physical communities and spaces. So we need to combine new rights with new way of doing things, but always starting from where people need the most.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me add to that and just say three things. I think that are important to build on what Francesca said. One is that, we have to rethink housing and working in the society. And if cities are the places where most people live, then these experiments of how we rethink that are going to happen in cities. So the co-working spaces, community land trust, you ask about community control of housing. A land trust separates ownership from use, and it allows the land to stay affordable and housing to stay affordable. One of the things that's happening in cities with the agglomeration of people in cities is that land values are at historic highs. So if you're relying on the state or private actors to build housing, private developers can only do so if they charge a lot for housing, because they have to make a profit, and states, local or state governments or national governments have to put out more money that sometimes the cities don't have, which is why they rely on private actors. So community land trust is one way to take available urban land and put it in land trusts and build affordable housing that it stays affordable over time, because of the way that it separates out ownership, which is in a nonprofit land trust, and use. People get land long-term leases that they can then sell for limited equity. So you can build collective community well, you can keep it affordable, and you can also put other things in the land trust, such as commercial working spaces, et cetera. So I think we have to rethink housing and working in public space. For instance, I see a question about public space. The reopening of streets, as Francesca says, is happening all over in cities. You know, streets are now not just for cars, but if we have to social distance, it's more important than ever to use our public spaces in that way. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to say is that Francesca mentioned, and I don't want it to get lost, multi-governance, basically layered governance. All of these ways of experimentation are nested in government. So the one thing I do not want to leave people with is that we need to just let communities do this stuff, right? That the state gets to retreat into the background and not provide these goods. That's not what the commons is. It's not what these experiments are about. It really is about an enabling state, that the state has to step up with resources and help communities to create goods that meet their particular needs. Communities are going to look different. You're going to have some communities in Lower Manhattan that want bigger houses or that buy bigger places and want more outdoor space, but you're going to have more disadvantaged communities that need basic goods like fresh food because they don't live near a grocery market, parks, and affordable housing. So the idea is that the city, the local government, the state must step in and give people resources, whether it's land, available land, technical assistance, et cetera. And the third thing I want to say, building on what Francesca said, is that we need to think about some goods that are now privately provided to be public goods. And wireless connectivity, broadband connectivity is one of them. 1 in 3 households in the same communities that got hit by COVID do not have access to high-speed internet, even though New York City is a smart city and it has a linked NYC, where the telephone poles used to be, a wireless portal on almost every corner in some neighborhoods. But if you have kids standing outside those portals or public libraries or Starbucks trying to get a wireless signal to do the homework on their phone, then we have to rethink connectivity, right? That should be a right. And so these are all the ways I think that rethinking cities, that the pandemic is an opportunity to reset and to rethink how we provide all of these goods.
So there is one question related to trust. So do you think that the pandemic threatened trust between people, even inside small communities, and how can it be rebuilt? This is a very good question. You know, social distancing has kept us apart, and this is affecting social distancing. So I'm wondering, what's your take on how we rebuild trust, and especially in these neighborhoods or in small communities? And then I have another question about conflicts. I'll pose afterwards.
I will say on trust, I don't see the trust issue in these communities that I spoke about as being mistrust of other residents in the communities. In fact, I think I see them as mistrusting government, actually, because the development patterns and the way in which government has created these segregated and disadvantaged communities and disinvested in them. When government says we're going to do something or we're going to make sure you have affordable housing, often that doesn't come through. So I think that this is an opportunity to repair. And so Francisco was talking about more participatory democracy. So for instance, New York City has participatory budgeting, where the city allows neighborhoods to decide how to spend public money. I think those kind of participatory experiments and, commons-based experiments with the state enabling them, can help to rebuild trust between communities in the state. That's the trust I see that needs to be rebuilt.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say a very similar thing, that I think that we really need to use this breakdown of society during the COVID, in particular in the healthcare system, in the care system, and in the essential work. I mean, in the essential work that were provided to rebuild trust. Probably trust with the state. And so think that, you know, the state should be part of the solution. And it's not, I mean, the state shouldn't be always the one to blame or the one to have to retreat, because, you know, then we will have the solutions will be provided magically by the market. But the state should also learn to devolve power to people. So like it's almost like this all commons. I think for me, this all learning from the commons and building the commons is really to find this new ground that is not that is not the public as the state and is not the private. It's something else. It's a new space that obviously should be built on solid public grounds. So it should be built on the basis of this restored trust that we have with public institutions and the state that can provide, you know, essential services and can be enabling, you know, this community empowerment. But then we need to construct also space for communities to develop their own ability to you know, to grow their initiatives and their project and their freedom, basically. So this is the new ground that should be cultivated. But yes, I agree that it is about maybe rebuilding this trust in the future through the state, through the public, and also through a kind of joint governance.
Thank you. I have one question, and we are very close to the end of this mind-blowing session, I would say. It's from Luca. He's actually a colleague. He teaches at Luiss, and he's asking me, it's Luca Giustiniano, I can say it loud. He's a colleague I look up to. And he's asking a very interesting question, because it's about basically, we know that in the city, and after the pandemic, this has been also covered in our conversation, a lot of conflicts and a lot of contradictions popped up. And policymaking is about trying to solve these conflicts. How would you think that national or urban policymaking will address these conflicts? And in particular, if I may add, all these approaches that we've been talking about, of a cooperation between the public, the state, and communities, how will be perceived by, you know, by the private sector, that we know is sometimes as not aligned interests, but sometimes interestingly enough, we may find you know, on the same side of the state or communities. So how do you think that this cooperation and the role of the private sector and this policymaking can solve these conflicts?
Okay. You want me to start?
Whoever wants to start, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I really think that the role of the public sector or the policy making, as you said, is not to resolve the conflict or the contradiction. Is actually, I mean, to bring attention to the structural causes that are causing this conflict, to the structural inequalities, and to make them visible, and to propose a transformative project that would address those structural causes that emerge as conflicts. So I think it's very different than you know, resolving them, because we will only be able to resolve them if we make clear what are the structural causes. So we do not find solutions that do not address those structural causes. And I think this is the role of courageous policy making. And then on the private public, I think that is very clear at the moment that we cannot have this kind of future-oriented, innovation-led, inclusive, and sustainable growth if we do not work public and private at the same level. So, and this means, you know, having a pact, a new social pact that will address this kind of big questions for the future, which involve a great deal of public investment, but also obviously let's say conditionalities in this investment mean that the private sector, for instance, how do I invest in a kind of carbon neutral future if I'm bailing out airways, you know, like the big airways companies? Well, this means that also the airways companies, they have to commit to decarbonization and to shift into to a more like to a green and sustainable future, and they have to start changing their industrial bases, and also they have to say we want better jobs and jobs of quality, and we are not going to fire people with public money during the bailouts. So I mean, this is the deals that we want. We want big companies that also start investing in the future, but do it on terms that will also maximize public return. And then we want the public to invest and do it in a transformative way, also bringing communities and people at the very center of this decision making. So, I mean, maybe I'm making, I mean, this is a transformative project that we want. So but obviously for me, it is clear that both public and private has to start, you know, working together if we really want to bet that this is not going to go back to the past that created these structural problems, but it's going to go in the future direction that is more, you know, just for everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a role for public and private, and they're different, but also at some point they're also intertwined. So let me start where Francesca did, which is, you know, it's a great question. So what role can public policies and policymaking play when you have these contradictions and tensions in cities? So let me be very concrete. We've seen the protests in the street, right? One of the responses to the protests have been new policies at the state, federal, and local level. Don't allow chokeholds in the police to choke. Defund means New York City police are $6 billion, and that's their budget. The city has said we're going to take 1 to 2 of that billion and put it in communities. That's a policy, right, to allow these kind of experiments. At the national level, the Racial Justice Act, we should make lynching a crime. We should make the ways in which communities are that the state allows and sometimes is complicit in structural inequality create. So structural inequalities, structural issues don't come out of nowhere. Right? They're actually they're baked into our system. This is why the protests aren't just about George Floyd. This is, I always say, you know, if you look at what happened in the 1940s in this country and whole communities were redlined and they couldn't get financing, and that stopped. And then you look at the mortgage crisis or in 2008, and the people that lost their homes are the same communities that were in those redlined neighborhoods. And then if you look at the COVID crisis, those same communities are the same communities that lost their homes and were redlined in the 1940s. So this is baked into our system, and policies can unravel that, right? So I do think there's a role for the public to use policies as a response, because we don't have to guess why we have structural inequality. We know why we have structural inequalities, but we haven't been able as a government at all levels to address and to really find the courage. So now when people say defund the police, it's not about hating the police. It's about put your money where your mouth is. That's number one. Number two, I think, is that the private sector, we've also seen the private companies come out and say, we believe in racial justice, we believe in affordable housing, et cetera. They also are beginning to put their money where their mouth is, because, you know, who pays for these new public utilities for wireless and we need the private sector to invest, because so much of our capital and money in the society is concentrated in a few hands, right? In Google and Facebook and Apple. And so, for instance, so those sectors, when they step up and say, we're going to put money into the solution, I think that's important. And finally, what, you know, Christian has written about is the idea of public community and private partnerships. we also have to find ways to put together those kind of partnerships to solve huge problems like housing and like access to basic goods that people need to survive and thrive in cities and communities. And so these kind of partnerships are very important. And I think that we see very interesting examples, including in Barcelona and other cities.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you, Francesca. I think that we were able to cover this topic in a very unconventional way, I would say, without fantasizing too much about it, and actually nailing down some of the critical issues that are on the table. So I leave now the floor to our provost, Andrea Prencipe, for the closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a very interesting and compelling masterclass. I'm a bit angry because there were no disagreements whatsoever. Just, but there was nothing, of course, planned. But and it's interesting how the different perspectives, will somehow got together and identify a number of issues which are again relevant, but have been analyzed in depth. And also we offered indications, suggestions on how to go about. I've appreciated the third way that Francesca mentioned, the data democracy suggestion for in between, the more state vis-a-vis the big tech, as far as the role of digitalization and the extent to which we can use, in inverted commas, it to create more digital participation. I appreciated the comments by Sheila about the importance of thinking or rethinking the housing system, and also the last comments on structural inequality, the extent to which we should actually address it with probably new lenses. But let me just tell one thing I disagree with, but it's not just with the masterclass, but in general, the terminology that we use in this sort of potentially post-COVID era, I think is a bit tired, because whenever we think about what's next, we always say we need to rethink, rebuild, reset. I think we need to build, design, and set. And I thought it was just an Italian issue, because we Italians, as the famous historian from England, Dennis Smith used to say, Italians, every time there is a new thing, they have the RE put in front of the word. So we have the Rinascimento, we have the Risorgimento. I mean, what? Let's build, let's put at the basis of this new design of the way we would design of new cities, design of new housing system. Let's put the key issues that you have brilliantly touched upon. Equality, sustainability. Francesca was talking about the issues of decarbonizations and the like. So let's be more sort of proactive. This is probably because I'm the son of an engineer, so I'm into the not redesign but design. Let me finish with one really sort of kind of academically interesting twist on one of the words that would use a lot, that both Sheila and Francesca use a lot. It's more than what is a qualifier. Both of you use a lot concrete. So you concretely address the issue. This is a concrete suggestion. This is a concrete indication. So I was remember last weekend I was reading an interesting article by an Italian sociologist, Mauro Magatti, who actually identified the root of the word, and the root of concrete come from Latin. Guess what? Is cum crescere, which means growing with. And it goes a little beyond the idea that everybody has about concrete issues, because concrete, of course, it has to do with solid, immediate result. But cum crescere, growing with, somehow puts a more dynamic, spin, twist to it. a dynamic spin, a dynamic twist that can actually accommodate both, the immediate result, the material issue, but also the more symbolic one, the individual dimension and the collective one that you've touched upon, and also the dreaming that that comes with the dynamics, as well as the accomplishment, something that we need to do pretty soon. So on this more kind of Latin literature, and thanks again for this very interesting debate. Thanks to Christian for moderating and chairing the debate. Thanks, Sheila, for connecting from New York and not from Washington, as I mentioned early on. And thanks, Francesca, for your contribution. Thanks again, and we'll see again our audience this upcoming Thursday for the new masterclass with Diego Dalla Valle, who is the chairman of TODS, and Michele Costabile, debating about the unique dimension of the Italian made in Italy. Okay, see you Thursday. Bye-bye.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.